Daniel Reyes thought he was buying silence, 22 acres of cracked runway, and a rusting hangar in the New Mexico desert. What he found instead was a sealed hatch tied to his mother's forgotten past, and a machine that could bend time itself. This isn't just a story of an airfield, it's a story of family sacrifice and a legacy too heavy to bury. Stay with me until the end. And if this kind of story grips you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The desert highway stretched endlessly in front of him. 2 faded lanes disappearing into the horizon, the asphalt cracked and shimmering with heat. Daniel "Danny" Reyes gripped the steering wheel of the rented pickup with hands that had known the weight of rifles, the recoil of artillery, the trembling pulse of brothers in arms dying beneath them. 32 years old, though the lines at the corners of his eyes suggested more. The desert did not forgive, and neither did memory. The Corps had taught him to live with both. He pulled off the road at a rusting sign that leaned like it had given up a fight long ago. Federal Property Restricted Access. The white letters sun-faded to gray. Beyond the gate stretched 22 acres of nothing. A runway that looked more like scar tissue than pavement hangars, collapsing inward as though ashamed of their bones, and silence that pressed against his ears, with the intimacy of grief. He killed the engine and sat in the heavy quiet. PTSD made moments like this dangerous. The quiet could be a comfort, or it could be a trigger. Sometimes silence felt like the pause before an ambush. He breathed in the dry air until his heart steadied. This was what he wanted, wasn't it? Space. Distance from the ghosts of Kabul, from the accident report that had reduced his wife's life to 3 sterile sentences, from the expectations of people who didn't understand why he woke up at 0400 with his fists clenched. He swung out of the truck and pushed open the gate. The chain link rasped across the dirt like an old warning. Inside, the airfield smelled of rust-sunburnt concrete and a faint trace of oil, the kind of scent that lingers decades after the machines are gone. He walked the cracked runway slowly, boots crunching gravel, and tried to picture what this place had once been. The thunder of engines, the shouted orders, the kind of disciplined chaos only the military could produce. Now it was nothing but weeds and birds. He should have felt peace. Instead, he felt a pull like the land itself was waiting. 2 days later, he drove into the nearest town, a place with 1 diner, 1 gas station, and a government building that tried to look important but failed against the enormity of the desert. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and dust. The clerk behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with hair pinned tight, slid a manila folder toward him. "Property history," she said. "Since this land was federal, you get access to the file." Danny nodded, though his stomach had already tightened. He opened the folder right there under the fluorescent lights. Maps, dates, budget allocations. Then a sheet of personnel assignments, names typed in neat columns. His hand froze halfway down the page. Elena Reyes, Flight Engineer Project Orion. For a moment, the room tilted. He was 10 again, standing at his aunt's kitchen table, clutching an accident report that said automobile accident. He was 10, asking questions that received only silence. He was 10, watching his mother's face fade from memory because no one spoke her name. And now here she was, typed in black ink, connected to a project he had never heard of. "Everything okay?" the clerk asked, gentle. Marines learn how to keep their voices steady even when their insides collapse. "Yes, ma'am," Danny said. His eyes dropped back to the page, his mother's name anchoring him and undoing him all at once. He turned another page. A thin envelope slipped free and landed on the counter. Its flap had never been sealed. Across the front, "Confidential Project Orion, do not forward." He picked it up carefully, as if it might burn. Inside was a single page redacted to black bars, but the words that remained were enough test articles. Field generator, non-combustive propulsion, pilot clearance Reyes E. His throat went dry. His mother had been part of something secret, something experimental, something buried. When he signed the deed an hour later, his hand did not shake, though his chest felt hollow. The clerk gave him the keys like it was any other transaction, but to him it wasn't about land anymore. It was about Elena, the woman who had kissed his forehead before school, who had laughed at her own bad cooking, who had died too young, had not been who he thought she was. He stepped outside into the glare of desert light folder under his arm. The sky was merciless blue, the kind of blue that reveals everything and hides nothing. For the first time in years, Danny felt the stirrings of a mission. Not one given by the Corps, not one written on deployment orders. This was personal. He had come to New Mexico looking for silence. Instead, he had found a doorway into his mother's secrets. That night, back in the hangar, he spread the folder on the floor beside his bedroll. The lantern's glow caught the ink, the lines of maps and diagrams. He traced her name with his thumb, until it blurred, until it almost felt alive. The desert wind rattled the metal sheets overhead, a low percussion that seemed to say, "You came back for a reason." He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. In the dark, he whispered her name, Elena, like a prayer, like a promise. Tomorrow he would begin searching. The hangar became his shelter, a cathedral of rust and shadow, where pigeons nested in the rafters, and the desert wind sang in long moans across broken panels of sheet metal. Danny spread his bedroll on the concrete near a stack of forgotten crates, the cold seeping up into his bones even through the thin insulation. He made it a ritual each night: boil water on his compact camping stove, pour it over instant coffee granules, eat half a protein bar or a pouch of old military rations, then sit with his back against the wall and listen. Listening was something he had learned in the Corps, when silence told you more than shouting ever could. Out here, silence was not absence. It was a presence that pressed down on him, testing the limits of his endurance. When he finally lay back on the bedroll, his eyes traced the geometry of the roof beams until they blurred into dark rivers. Sleep came in pieces. Sometimes he found himself back in Afghanistan, dust storms whipping the valley as his unit pushed through the village, only to hear the thunderclap of an ambush. Sometimes it was the night phone call telling him his wife was gone. Her car crushed against a guardrail in another state, while he had been thousands of miles away, unable to answer her last message. He woke from those dreams with his breath caught in his throat, his fists clenched around nothing. Other nights were worse because he did not dream of war or loss, but of a vast emptiness. A desert without horizon where someone whispered his name over and over. He would sit upright, sweat cooling quickly in the desert night lantern, casting his shadow long across the hangar wall. On the fourth night, he noticed it, a faint metallic tapping, irregular but persistent, coming from beneath the concrete floor. At first, he thought it was the building settling a trick of the wind, rattling loose bolts. But it returned night after night, soft yet insistent, like a pulse trying to synchronize with his own. He moved his lantern across the floor, crouching to press his ear against the concrete. Cold radiated through unnatural in the heat of summer. The sound was real. It was not his imagination or the echo of memory. Something beneath the hangar lived or remembered. He did not tell himself stories. Marines trusted what was in front of them. But as the hours stretched toward dawn, Danny could not shake the sense that the tapping was less mechanical and more deliberate, as if someone was waiting for him to answer. By day, he tried to drown the unease in work. He cleared scrap metal patched holes with salvaged sheet, swept decades of dust until the air glittered with motes. He walked the runway at sunrise, and again at dusk, counting his strides like prayers, reminding himself of the discipline that had once kept him alive. Yet the desert offered no distraction strong enough to erase the image of his mother's name on that folder Elena Reyes tied forever to this place. He felt her absence like a pressure in the air. It was on one of those morning patrols that he saw the imprint. Near the far side of the hangar, where the dust lay thick as flour, a set of boot prints crossed the floor, sharp recent military issue. His heart jolted. He knelt and touched the edge of one heel. The dust was barely disturbed around it. He had not made these. He lived alone on 22 acres, surrounded by fence and silence. Yet here was evidence of another presence. He followed the print's breath shallow until they stopped near a collapsed workbench. No sign of entry or exit, as if whoever left them had vanished into the air. The discipline drilled into him years ago told him to secure the perimeter, to sweep for intruders, to catalog every possible breach. But another voice, quieter, older, told him to be still. Whoever had left those prints was not careless. They had wanted him to see. The discovery left him restless, pacing the hangar until dusk fell. That night, the tapping under the floor seemed louder, though he could not be sure if it was the sound itself or his mind amplifying it. He lay awake, staring at the rafters until his vision blurred, then rolled onto his side and pulled his duffel close. As he dug for his last ration pack, his hand brushed the fabric of his old service jacket. He pulled it out and shook it, dust rising in a cloud. In the inner pocket, fingers found something stiff folded. He drew it out slowly, unfolding the creased photograph. The lantern light revealed a black and white image, edges yellowed the paper soft with age. His breath caught. It was his mother. Elena, younger than he remembered, wearing a flight suit, hair pulled back in a way he had never seen, standing right in front of this hangar. Behind her, the same corrugated walls, the same wide doors, only unbroken and proud. She wasn't a nurse here. She wasn't who they told him she was. She was part of something larger, and she had been erased from it. Danny stared until his eyes blurred. He traced the outline of her figure with his thumb, the way a boy touches the ghost of a hand. The photograph smelled faintly of dust and old cloth, but for him it carried the warmth of beans cooking on a kitchen stove, of laughter drifting through a house too small for secrets. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his breast pocket close to his heart. The tapping under the floor resumed, steady as a heartbeat. The boot prints waited in the dust. His mother's eyes in the photo seemed to look past him toward something unseen. Danny sat in the silence, coffee cooling in his cup, the lantern's light shaking faintly. He knew the quiet had turned into a question, and soon he would have to answer it. The days bled into each other, measured not by clocks, but by the rhythm of work. Danny stripped rusted metal sheets from the hangar roof, dragged away corroded barrels, and swept until his lungs ached with the taste of dust. He told himself the labor was cleansing, that every pile of debris carried off was another piece of the past made lighter. But in truth, the weight only grew. The photograph of his mother stayed folded in his breast pocket, a constant reminder that what he had inherited here was not silence, but mystery. At night, the metallic tapping beneath the floor persisted, sometimes soft, sometimes strong enough to vibrate the coffee tin on his work table. He lay awake, listening, each sound burrowing deeper into his mind, until one morning he resolved to track it to its source. He began clearing the far end of the hangar, a space cluttered with twisted shelving and empty drums. Beneath one barrel heavier than the others, his boot caught the edge of something solid. He shoved the drum aside, dust rising in a choking cloud, and crouched. There it was, a square of steel, set flush with the concrete. Its edges welded its surface, scarred but unmistakably deliberate. A hatch. The tapping had led him here. He knelt and brushed the grime away. Weld seams traced the perimeter, thick and purposeful, as though someone had wanted this door never to open again. His pulse quickened. Instinct told him it was dangerous. Experience told him it was forbidden. Yet every part of him knew he could not walk away. Danny retrieved his portable grinder, strapped on his goggles, and began cutting. Sparks sprayed across the concrete, hissed in the dry air, and settled like fleeting stars around his boots. The metal groaned under the blade, each cut releasing the smell of scorched iron. Hours passed in sweat and noise. He paused only to wipe his forehead, his breath fogging inside the mask. When the final seam cracked, he pressed his hand against the hatch. The steel was colder than desert nights, colder than the memory of loss. He pulled back, startled at the chill, then leaned again, listening. The silence pressed close. Then the hatch shuddered. Not from his touch, not from the grinder's vibrations, but from something beneath. The movement was subtle, a push from below, as though unseen hands were testing the seal. His breath froze in his chest. Training told him to step back to evaluate to secure, but his body stayed rooted. He watched the hatch tremble a second time, then go still. The hangar seemed to hold its breath. He told himself it could be settling concrete, a pocket of air released after decades. Yet he knew better. His hand tightened on the pry bar. As if on cue, a sound drifted from across the room. He turned. On an old workbench sat a radio, a relic with its antenna bent and speaker rusted. He had found it during cleanup and left it there, a dead machine in a place full of them. Now, without warning, the radio crackled to life. Static filled the hangar, sharp and jagged, and then through the static came a voice. A woman's voice, faint, broken, but unmistakably human. "Danny, don't go down." His knees weakened. He ripped off his goggles and stared at the radio, heart hammering. The voice had been soft, urgent, and it had spoken his name. He staggered forward, hand outstretched as if he might steady the machine. The static snapped once more, and then cut off, leaving the hangar plunged into silence deeper than before. He waited, breath shallow, but the voice did not return. He bent over the radio and noticed a faint red battery indicator glowing behind the cracked dial, as if some hidden auxiliary feed still trickled power into the old machine. Dust puffed from the dials. Nothing. The machine was dead again, as lifeless as when he first found it. He stepped back, hands shaking, and looked to the hatch. The steel lay there, scarred by his grinder, cold air still seeping from its edges. He pressed his palm to it once more, and again the chill traveled through his arm, into his chest, into his very breath. He whispered his mother's name without meaning to a plea or a prayer, and the hangar answered only with silence. The hatch remained closed, but it waited, and he felt the weight of that waiting settle upon him. The photograph in his pocket pressed against his heart, as if urging him forward, and the memory of the voice lingered, fragile, yet undeniable. Something beneath that door knew him. Something had spoken, and he could not pretend otherwise. The hatch gave way with a final creak, hinges screaming after decades of stillness, and a breath of air, unlike the desert, rolled upward, cold and metallic, the scent of iron and stone mingling with something older. Danny hesitated only long enough to tighten the straps of his pack, adjust the flashlight on his chest, and grip the handle of his pry bar like a lifeline. The voice from the radio still echoed in his memory, but silence now stretched around him, thick as cloth. He lowered himself onto the first concrete step boots, scraping the sound, oddly muffled, as if the underground swallowed it whole. Each step descended into deeper shadow walls, damp with condensation, that should not have existed in the middle of a New Mexico desert. The air tasted faintly of refrigerant, as if a sealed environmental unit deeper below was still bleeding cold into the corridor. Somewhere below, a refrigeration system, or what was left of it, was still alive. His light caught rebar jutting from the ceiling, droplets of water, clinging like beads of glass. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by his movement, settling again in slow surrender. The stairwell opened into a corridor, long and narrow, its walls unpainted concrete that sweated moisture and carried the faint smell of mildew. He ran his fingers along the surface and felt the grit of decades. The temperature dropped further, seeping into his jacket, into his bones. Then his light fell on words carved into the wall, letters chiseled with precision and permanence. Authorized Reyes, family only. His chest tightened. The surname had weight here, etched into the very foundation, waiting across time for someone who bore it. His breath clouded in the beam of light. He whispered the words aloud, almost reverently, as though repeating them would make them real. Deeper down the hall, doors lined the walls, some sealed, others ajar. He passed by rooms filled with rusted cots, shelves of broken instruments, filing cabinets overturned like casualties of a hurried evacuation. Papers curled with age littered the floor in nests of dust. He crouched to lift one, the ink-faded but legible technical logs, dated early 1980s. He tucked it away and moved on each discovery, pulling him further from hesitation. The hall ended in a wide chamber that must once have been a control room. Rows of consoles stretched before him, their screens convex, and dark wires dangling from the ceiling like arteries of a corpse. He swept his light across the room and saw pinned beneath a shard of fallen ceiling tile a rolled blueprint. He freed it carefully, unrolling the stiff paper across a desk. There it was, crisp lines and engineering notations, the profile of a craft unlike any he had seen. A clipped personnel addendum listed her last promotion, Capta, Reyes Test Pilot Clearance. Sleek, triangular wings reduced almost to memory engines, compact to impossibility. Across the corner of the page, in handwriting that shook his chest more than the cold, a name was signed Elena Reyes, 1983. His mother. She had not been a bystander. She had not been a nurse assigned to auxiliary duty. She had been central, her name inked on the design of something extraordinary. Danny pressed his palm to the signature as if he could feel warmth still trapped in the paper. The silence broke with a faint hum. One of the consoles flickered a weak glow bleeding from its monitor. A needle on a wall gauge trembled at the AOX Power Orion core mark, as if something deeper was feeding the room. He stepped back, instincts tightening, but the glow steadied lines of code blinking alive on the ancient screen. Then the words appeared green against black, deliberate and unnerving. Welcome E. Reyes. The console tagged the entry as Captain E. Reyes, yet moments later another line blinked beneath lineage override DNA verified D. Reyes, his name. His breath caught in his throat. He had not touched the machine. He had not powered anything. Yet the bunker recognized him as though the blood in his veins had been enough. Her name slipped out no louder than a breath. Drawn by a mix of dread and need, he searched the cabinets along the wall. Most held nothing but mold-stained binders, yet one drawer jammed halfway open revealed a stack of personnel records. He pulled them out, the paper brittle, and began to leaf through. The words blurred until one page froze him. A certificate of death. Name Elena Reyes. Cause test flight incident. Orion program. His vision swam. For 22 years, his family had told him it was a car accident. For 22 years, he had carried the image of shattered glass and wet asphalt. Now, in the fluorescent hum of a forgotten bunker, he read that his mother had died in a test flight. Not a car, not a road, but here beneath the desert in the shadow of Orion. His knees bent under the weight, and he sank against the cabinet, the page trembling in his hands. The hum from the console deepened, steady and patient, as though it waited for him to accept. Dust floated in the beam of his light, settling on the blueprint on the certificate on his shoulders. He pressed his forehead to his fist, eyes closed, and the silence pressed back, filled with the faint memory of a woman's voice, a warning that still lingered in his ears. The bunker had given him truth, but truth was never enough. It always demanded more. The hatch above seemed impossibly far away now, and in the cold underground he felt the weight of footsteps that were not his own waiting just beyond the next doorway. The air above ground felt harsh after the damp chill of the bunker. Danny climbed the last steps and pushed open the hatch, his shoulders tight, his lungs dragging in the dry desert air as though he had surfaced from drowning. The sun was sinking behind the jagged ridges, throwing the runway into bands of gold and shadow. He blinked against the light and stepped out into silence that was almost too complete. But he wasn't alone. Parked just beyond the hangar doors stood a jeep so old it looked like it belonged to another war. Beside it stood a man, tall, though stooped with age, his frame wiry shoulders still carrying a soldier's memory of posture. His hair was white-cut close, and his face lined deeply by time and sun. The man's eyes found Danny at once sharp and unblinking. Danny's hand went instinctively to his belt, where a weapon might once have hung, though now he carried only tools. The man raised a hand in acknowledgement, not greeting, but recognition. Reyes. His voice was rough gravel layered over years of command. Danny nodded slowly. Daniel Reyes, he said. The man studied him a moment longer, then spoke with the gravity of one who had waited too long for this moment. Major Franklin, I served with your mother. The name struck Danny harder than the chill of the bunker. He stepped closer, searching Franklin's face for deception, for some trace of the truth. Franklin did not smile. He looked past Danny at the hangar at the hatch that now lay ajar. His jaw tightened. I promised her I would guard that door to hold it shut until the day her bloodline returned. She believed only her family would understand what Orion truly meant. That was my duty to wait, not to destroy. His voice carried not anger, but sorrow, heavy and undeniable. But you opened it, didn't you? Danny swallowed, unable to answer, the silence serving as admission. Franklin's eyes softened just slightly, but his hands trembled where they rested on the Jeep's fender. He took a long breath, then continued. Your mother was a brilliant engineer, but brilliance has a cost. I was there the day she... He faltered, voice breaking for the first time. The day she didn't come back. Danny's chest clenched. I was told it was a car accident, he said, voice raw. Franklin shook his head, the motion slow, deliberate, full of grief. That's the lie they gave your family. The truth is worse. I was the one who collected what was left, Danny. The craft she flew tore itself apart on re-entry, and what we found... His voice drifted into silence, leaving the weight of unfinished words to settle between them. Danny's knees felt weak. He braced himself against the hangar wall, the desert tilting around him. His mother had died here in the project whose blueprints he now carried, and Franklin had been her witness. The old soldier reached into his coat, pulled something from an inner pocket and held it out with both hands, as though offering a fragile relic. It was a cassette tape, the plastic worn but intact, a strip of masking tape across its surface, labeled in faded ink, E. Reyes Flight Log. Danny took it carefully, the object heavier in meaning than in weight. His fingers shook as they brushed Franklin's. She recorded this before the final test, Franklin said. She wanted a record. Maybe she wanted someone someday to know the truth. I couldn't destroy it. Danny stared at the cassette, his throat closing. The thought of hearing his mother's voice again after decades sent fear and longing colliding in his chest. Franklin's gaze held his unwavering. She was more than they told you, more than they allowed her to be. But she carried a burden. And now so do you. The wind picked up, tugging at Danny's jacket, rattling the loose metal of the hangar doors. Franklin looked toward the horizon, as though expecting something or someone to arrive. His shoulders sagged, years pressing down. I kept my promise as long as I could, he said quietly. But promises die with time. Now it's yours to decide what happens to that door. Danny felt the cassette burn in his palm, the weight of history and blood. The sky dimmed further, the last light, painting the runway in long shadows, and the air between them grew heavy, with everything still unsaid. The cassette felt fragile in his hands, its plastic edges worn smooth, as if it had passed through many pockets before finally reaching him. Danny stared at the faded label for a long while, the initials of his mother's name written in handwriting that looked rushed, almost afraid of being erased. He slipped it into the battered player Franklin had left him, and pressed play. At first, only static filled the air, sharp and uneven like the scrape of wind against an old antenna. Then came a voice. His mother's voice. Soft trembling, filled with urgency that seemed to reach across the years. Orion does more than fly. She whispered the words, broken by static. It takes me somewhere time is no longer straight. If you hear this, it means I didn't return. Danny, forgive me. The tape clicked, hissed, and fell silent. Danny sat still, the sound lingering inside him like a heartbeat he could not calm. He pressed the player to his chest, eyes closing, and for a moment he felt as if he were 10 again, sitting at a kitchen table while she hummed over a pot of beans. But the memory bled into the truth. She had been part of something she could never explain, something larger than both of them, and it had taken her away. He rose slowly, a heaviness pressing into his shoulders. The hangar stretched wide around him, empty except for the scattered crates and the yawning hatch he had uncovered. The silence did not comfort. It demanded. He lit the lantern again and began opening boxes that had been left to rust. Inside were pieces of machinery, wrapped in aged canvas coils of wire metal plates, etched with symbols he could not recognize. His fingers moved with instinct, the old discipline of marine maintenance guiding him, though the parts were nothing he had ever serviced before. He arranged them on a workbench, aligning connectors, tightening bolts, piecing together fragments of something that should not exist in the world he thought he knew. Over several days of near wordless work, sleeping in snatches, he watched the frame of Orion 7 reassemble as if the parts themselves wanted to find each other. Each part carried a strange precision, a design far ahead of its time. As he shifted one box aside, something small tumbled free and clattered to the floor. He bent down and picked it up. It was a ring, simple gold, dulled with age, the inside engraved with initials, his mother's wedding band. Franklin had only kept the tape. The rest of her belongings had been locked away in storage after the crash, still marked with dried blood and forgotten in the hangar. But along the outer edge, dried brown stains clung stubbornly, the unmistakable residue of blood. His hand tightened around it, and his throat closed. She must have worn it on that final flight. Whatever had torn her from the sky had left this behind. He slid the ring into his pocket with care, feeling its presence press against the photograph already there, and the two together seemed to anchor him to both grief and duty. He moved to the filing cabinet in the corner, one drawer jammed, but willing under his pull. Folders spilled forward brittle pages inked with notations. Among them he found a bound notebook, its cover cracked but intact. He flipped through cautiously his light grazing lines of dense handwriting. It was a flight log, but unlike any he had seen. Dates from the early days of Project Orion. Notes on atmospheric conditions, propulsion calibrations, physiological observations. He stopped on one page, the words underlined in haste. Test pilot 1 exposure 15 minutes. Return aged 30 years. Subject unrecognizable. Danny read it again and again, his pulse hammering. The notes described a man who entered the craft at 25 and stepped out at 55. Hair white skin, slack eyes, haunted. The log ended abruptly, the next page torn. Danny shut the notebook and leaned back against the desk, breath unsteady. His mother's cassette echoed in his mind, time is no longer straight. The notebook confirmed it. Orion did not just fly. It bent something fundamental, something human bodies were not meant to endure. He stared at the scattered parts on the table, the strange alloy coils, the transparent plates the machine forming like a skeleton under his hands. He realized he was rebuilding not just an aircraft, but an inheritance, a legacy, both brilliant and cursed. The lantern flickered shadows bending across the hangar's ribbed walls, and in the silence he thought he heard again the faint metallic tapping from below. Steady, patient, reminding him that the story was not finished. The cassette still lay warm in Danny's pocket, pressed against the photograph, and the wedding ring when the ground began to tremble with a low vibration that was not wind or storm, but engines. He froze, lantern swaying from the hook overhead as the noise swelled. Headlights cut across the desert dusk beams, slicing through the cracked hangar windows. A convoy approached, black vehicles with armored bodies rolling in deliberate formation, tires grinding gravel. Danny's pulse raced. He ducked behind a stack of crates and killed the lantern, the hangar dropping into shadow. The first truck stopped just outside doors, opening in practiced sequence. Boots hit the ground heavy and disciplined. Franklin, who had been sitting on a folding chair near the hangar's edge, stood slowly, his frame tense but unshaken. A beam of light fixed on him. Major Franklin, a voice boomed through a loudspeaker, cold and precise. Step forward. Danny watched as Franklin squared his shoulders and walked toward the light, the years falling away to reveal the officer still living inside him. Soldiers in black tactical gear surrounded him, their rifles raised. One man pressed Franklin against the jeep, securing his wrists with practiced efficiency. Danny clenched his fists, instinct urging him to act, but the sight of a dozen rifles kept him rooted. The loudspeaker crackled again. "Sergeant Daniel Reyes, we know you are inside. Hand over all project materials immediately, or we will breach and open fire." The title struck him like a physical blow. They knew his name, his rank, his presence here. He tightened against the crate, sweat cold along his back. Through the shadows, he glimpsed their formation. A perimeter had been established, vehicles positioned to block every escape. This was not a coincidence. Someone had been watching. He reached for the pry bar at his side, though it felt useless against such force. His mind worked quickly, recalling entry points, cover possible lines of retreat. But this was not a battlefield where he had his unit at his side. This was him alone hiding in the hangar that had become a tomb of secrets. Then came the sound that shattered his focus. A soldier stepped into the light, removing his helmet. For a moment, Danny could not breathe. The man's face was unmistakable, though it carried lines and a pallor that had not been there before. Corporal Mason, his friend, his brother-in-arms, and the man Danny had watched fall in a firefight years ago, lifeless in the dirt of a distant country. Danny's throat closed. He shook his head, unable to reconcile the image before him with the memory etched in blood. Mason's eyes found him in the darkness, as though he knew exactly where Danny crouched. He spoke, his voice firm, clear enough to cut through the night without amplification. "Danny," he said, "I know you can hear me. They told you I was gone. You saw me fall. But you were wrong." Danny pressed a hand against the cold concrete, his body rigid. His mind screamed denial. He remembered the medics, the lifeless body covered by a tarp, the grief that had carved into him ever since. Yet here, Mason stood alive. The soldier took a step closer to the hangar door, his face caught by the beam of headlights, his expression steady, yet tinged with something unreadable. "I died out there." Mason continued his words, slow, deliberate. "Orion brought me back." But his voice carried a hollow echo, his movements too precise. Danny realized with a chill that this was no resurrection. Mason was an echo shaped by Orion, a construct wearing his friend's face. The sentence landed like a hammer against Danny's chest. The project that had stolen his mother, the machine whose blueprints he had touched with trembling hands, was somehow connected to this impossible return. His friend, his fallen comrade, claimed to be a product of it. The loudspeaker blared again, masking the moment with its cold demand. "Reyes, last chance. Deliver the files and equipment or we come in." Soldiers shifted positions, weapons angled toward the hangar. Franklin lifted his head from where he was restrained, his eyes finding Danny's shadow within. He did not speak, but the look carried both warning and plea. Danny's breath came sharp, his thoughts torn between the weight of the cassette in his pocket, the ghost of his mother's voice, and the figure of Mason standing alive outside. He knew this was no longer about silence or inheritance. The project was awake again, and its reach had already breached the grave. The soldiers closed in shadows, stretching across the cracked runway headlights, slicing through the desert dark. Danny's pulse hammered as Mason's voice echoed in his mind the impossible declaration that Orion had returned him from death. Every instinct told him to run, to fight, to vanish into the sand. But another force, stronger than fear, pushed him instead toward the hangar's heart. He slipped between crates' boots, silent on concrete, until the looming shape of Orion 7 rose before him. The craft looked like it had been waiting, its fuselage skeletal, yet complete enough to breathe. Danny climbed the ladder to the cockpit, his hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The seat molded around his frame as if it recognized him. Panels flickered faintly, then roared awake in a cascade of light. The air filled with a low hum that vibrated deep in his chest, a resonance that felt less mechanical than alive. Then came a voice through the internal speaker. Not Franklin, not the soldiers outside, but a woman's voice, trembling yet clear. "If you love this world," it said, "don't let Orion fly too high." Danny froze. It was her. His mother's voice recorded yet impossibly present, as though the machine itself carried her memory in its circuits. His throat tightened. He whispered Mom under his breath, and for a moment the years collapsed. He reached for the controls, fingers brushing against switches etched with symbols he did not recognize. The screens pulsed, scanning, then words appeared: DNA match, confirmed Reyes lineage. System access granted. Danny gripped the yoke, shock mixing with awe. Orion had not needed keys codes or clearance. It needed him, his blood, his family name. The system pulsed again, lights aligning in sequence across the console. Outside, the soldiers shouted the loudspeaker, demanding surrender. Franklin, still restrained, lifted his head, eyes catching the glow bleeding from the cockpit. For a moment, his lined face softened with something like resolve. He wrenched himself partly free from the soldier holding him and stumbled toward the hangar's edge. His captors tried to drag him back, but Franklin twisted his old body, fueled by something fiercer than strength. He reached a side panel on the hangar wall, flipped a hidden switch, and power surged through the floor beneath Danny's boots. Orion responded instantly. The hum deepened the glow, spreading through its frame like veins awakening. Franklin's voice rang out, hoarse but commanding. "Go, Danny. Finish what she started." His hands moved with the certainty of someone who had waited years for this moment, activating a sequence that no manual had ever recorded. Sparks leapt from the hangar walls, the air charged with static. Soldiers shouted, weapons clattering as they scrambled back. Danny's heart pounded. His training screamed that he should assess, strategize, control. But this was not a battlefield bound by rules. This was a machine tied to his mother's voice, a legacy coded into his DNA. His hands moved almost on their own, guided by something between memory and instinct. The console responded to him like a living thing, lights shifting as if they were following his breath. The yoke grew warm under his grip, the screens aligning to display a countdown he hadn't initiated. Outside, Mason stepped closer to the hangar helmet, off, face pale, in the glare. His voice carried through the chaos. "Danny, you don't know what it will do. It gave me back, but it takes more than it gives. Stop before it's too late." Danny shook his head, though Mason could not see the gesture. Too much had been hidden, too much stolen. The cassette still echoed in his mind, his mother's plea to forgive her. If Orion had the power to bend time to twist life and death, then the truth was buried deeper than warnings could reach. Franklin slammed another switch, his voice breaking. "It's now or never. They'll take it from you if you wait." Danny tightened his grip and exhaled. The craft shuddered, systems aligning in final sequence. The noise outside faded under the hum of something vast, something beyond human engines. The hangar trembled, dust falling like ash from its beams. Orion's panels pulsed in unison, as if breathing, as if ready. And in that moment, Danny knew the choice was no longer whether to fly. It was how far he was willing to follow where Orion would lead. The countdown that had bloomed across Orion's console reached 0, but instead of the roar of engines or the violent tremor of combustion, there was silence. Silence so deep it pressed against Danny's eardrums and made his own heartbeat thunder louder. The craft lifted effortlessly, its frame shimmering as if rejecting gravity itself, rising like a thought instead of a machine. Dust spiraled upward in soft columns, and the hangar beams rattled before groaning apart, roof panels collapsing in waves. Orion floated clear, its skin glowing faintly, and Danny gripped the yoke not as a pilot but as a passenger swept into something larger than intention. Through the canopy, the night sky fractured stars, bending colors bleeding together into ribbons he had no name for. The world outside distorted every angle of the desert, twisting until the familiar horizon dissolved. Then the visions began. In the light shapes formed faces he knew, faces he had lost. Mason as he had once been, laughing in the dust of deployment, whole and alive. His wife, her hair falling in the sunlight of a summer day, long gone her eyes, soft and steady. And his mother, younger than he remembered, standing tall in her flight suit, smiling at him with pride, unshadowed by secrecy. Danny's chest cracked open with longing and grief, tears sliding unnoticed as he reached toward the images shimmering in the glow. Their lips moved, though no sound carried. Yet he felt the words in his bones: forgiveness, love, the promise that he was not alone. Outside, chaos still reigned. Soldiers scrambled, shouting orders, drowned by the silence that accompanied Orion's ascent. Commanders gave signals, and from one of the armored vehicles a missile launcher tilted upward. The sky split with contrails as rockets streaked toward the glowing craft. Danny saw the trails through the shifting light, but Orion did not evade. Instead, the panels across its wings pulsed, and in the next instant a wave erupted outward, not sound, not fire, but a ripple that bent the very air. The missiles vanished mid-flight, dissolving into nothingness as though erased. The wave expanded, sweeping across the desert floor. Vehicles shuddered, twisted, then disappeared like sand brushed from glass. Soldiers who had been running froze mid-step, then blinked out erased in the same instant as the machines that carried them. Mason's outline flared white for a heartbeat, then dissolved into the same erasure as the soldiers, leaving nothing. Danny realized then that Mason's return had never been life. It had been Orion's illusion erased as easily as it had been granted. Only Franklin remained at the edge of the hangar, his hand braced on the wall, his eyes fixed on Orion with something beyond awe. The shockwave reached him last, its light washing over his frame. For a heartbeat, he stood there tall and unyielding, his expression calm, resolute, almost relieved. Then the glow engulfed him. When the brilliance receded, Franklin was gone. His officer's cap remained just beyond the dust-marked perimeter the wave had carved across the cracked concrete. Danny saw it through the fractured vision, and his throat tightened until he could not breathe. He wanted to scream to stop the machine, but Orion surged higher, pulling him into its glow, folding the night into colors that did not exist in the human world. Danny clutched the controls, but they no longer mattered. Orion was flying itself, its hum resonating not through engines, but through his own blood, a vibration that seemed to recognize him, bind him, carry him forward. His mother's voice whispered again through the cockpit, softer now, nearly tender. "If you love this world, do not let it climb too far." The words blurred with memory, with grief, with the shimmer of faces still lingering in the light. Danny held on to them even as Orion rose into a sky that was no longer sky, into a silence too vast for words. The light receded slowly like a tide retreating from the shore, and for a long moment Danny did not know if Orion was still in flight, or if the world itself had dissolved. His vision cleared in fragments, and the silence gave way to the rasp of his own breath, the weight of gravity reclaiming him. The craft lowered with a grace unlike anything human, settling gently onto the fractured pavement of the abandoned airstrip. The landing gear touched the earth without sound, and the hum that had carried him through visions of past and future faded into a faint vibration that finally stilled. Danny sat motionless in the cockpit, his hands still gripping the controls, though they were now dark, lifeless, as if they had never been lit. He exhaled shakily and pressed his forehead against the console, his heart heavy with what he had seen and lost. When he stepped out, the desert greeted him with emptiness. The airstrip stretched in every direction, silent, untouched, but not as he had left it. The air smelled ancient, the weeds that had once grown through cracks now brittle, as though time had skipped over this place and let centuries pass in the span of minutes, though in truth his watch still read the same hour, and the sun sat exactly where it should in the sky. The convoy was gone. The soldiers erased, Franklin vanished. Only the broken fences and crumbling asphalt remained bathed in the golden wash of evening sun. Danny stumbled forward, his boots crunching on gravel that felt older than it should. His body ached with exhaustion, his soul heavier still. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the cassette, the last tangible link to his mother, and placed it into the player. The tape clicked, hissed, and then her voice filled the silence. "Danny." She whispered softer than before, her words carrying a weight that pierced deeper than any command. "If you are alive, it means you carried this burden, and it is now yours. But don't let it steal your soul. Promise me, my son. Live." The tape ended in static, final, and unchanging. Danny held the player against his chest, his breath breaking, and then he sank to his knees on the cracked runway. The sun dipped lower shadows, stretching long, and he clutched the wedding ring he had found in the hangar, pressing it to his lips as sobs tore from him, raw and unguarded. He wept, not as a soldier, not as a man trained to endure, but as a child who had lost too much and finally let himself feel it. The grief poured from him in waves, carrying with it years of silence, anger, and longing. The lights inside the ruined hangar flickered once and died, leaving only silence. When the echo faded, Orion was gone, as though it had been nothing more than a fever dream. The runway, the desert, the sky, they bore no witness to the impossible machine that had carried him beyond the edge of time. Danny fell forward, palms pressed to the warm pavement, gasping, his tears staining the earth that had swallowed so much. As the light softened into dusk, he lifted his head. At the far end of the runway, where the horizon blurred into gold and shadow, a figure seemed to stand Elena in her flight suit cap under her arm. Danny blinked, and the image wavered like mirage. Yet when he raised his hand in a trembling salute, the wind itself seemed to pause in acknowledgement. Then the shimmer dissolved, leaving only the horizon. Only the fading sun remained, and the echo of that salute burned into his memory. Danny stood alone in the vast emptiness, his chest hollow yet strangely lighter. The cassette in his hand felt like a final gift, the ring in his pocket like an anchor to love that would not fade. He knew the secrets of Orion could never be erased from him, but neither could the memory of her voice, her smile, her salute. He walked slowly down the cracked runway, the silence of the desert stretching wide, his shadow long in the last light. He had come here searching for escape, for silence, for an ending. What he had found was legacy, truth and grief too deep for words. Yet beneath it all, something fragile, stirred, resolve, the faint possibility that he could still live, still honor what she had asked. The desert wind rose again, cool against his face, carrying with it the faintest whisper that might have been memory or might have been something more. Danny lowered his head, whispering into the fading light, "I promise, Mom." And with that, he kept walking one step after another until the runway ended and the night opened before him. If this story held you for a moment, if it made you pause and feel, I'd be grateful if you subscribed and stayed with me for the journeys still to come. Your thoughts matter. What part of Danny's story struck you the most? And what questions still linger in your mind? And tell me, where are you watching from tonight?